I thought the worst part of my life was already behind me. That's what people say when the house grows quiet and a calendar empties out. They call it surviving. They tell you to be grateful you're still standing. I believe them. It had been almost a year since my life began shrinking, not in dramatic ways, in small ones. My doctor's appointments were scheduled without asking. My bank statements started arriving already reviewed. Someone else began holding onto my car keys just in case. "You've been through enough," they said. "Let us handle it," they said. And little by little, I did. The first thing I noticed wasn't fear, it was confusion. A letter arrived one morning addressed to me, but written as if I were no longer the one making decisions. It referenced changes already approved, accounts adjusted, timelines confirmed. No signature from me. I sat at the kitchen table holding that letter, rereading the same sentence again and again, feeling something cold settle in my chest. Not grief, not anger, recognition. Because when your life begins to move without your permission, it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't warn you, it simply continues, efficient, polite, irreversible. And once you notice that, nothing ever feels ordinary again. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. That happens when you reach a certain age, at least that's what people like to believe. They smile a little too kindly, they speak a little more slowly, and they reassure you before you've even asked a question. So when I couldn't find my checkbook where it had always been, I blamed myself. When a utility bill arrived already marked paid, even though I didn't remember paying it, I assumed I had simply forgotten. When my son mentioned a meeting I didn't recall agreeing to, I nodded and let the moment pass. I even felt a brief flicker of relief. If things were being handled, maybe I didn't have to think so hard anymore. None of it was alarming on its own. That's the trick. Control is rarely taken all at once. It's removed in pieces small enough to seem reasonable, sensible even. But one afternoon, while sorting through a drawer I hadn't opened in months, I found something that didn't belong there. A copy of my signature. Not on a letter I remembered writing, not on a form I recognized, just my name, neatly reproduced, attached to an authorization I had no memory of granting. I sat down slowly. I had been signing my name the same way for over 50 years, through marriages, mortgages, births, and burials. I knew the weight of my own hand, the slight hesitation before the final letter. This was perfect, and I had never held that pen. The room felt suddenly off balance, as if the walls had shifted an inch without warning. My name was there in ink, clear and confident, yet it didn't belong to me. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle around me, every small sound amplified in the dark. I thought about how often decisions had been explained to me after they were made. How often "don't worry" had replaced "what do you think?" And for the first time, a question I wasn't ready to answer pressed itself forward. If I hadn't agreed to these changes, who had decided my life could move on without me? The next morning, I made a choice that would quietly change everything. I stopped asking questions out loud. Instead, I listened. There's a particular tone people use when they believe you're no longer keeping track. It's gentle, reassuring, and slightly impatient, like explaining something for the third time to a child who won't quite understand. I heard it when my daughter called to check in. She spoke easily, confidently, about plans I didn't remember agreeing to. A doctor's appointment moved to a different clinic, a financial review scheduled just to simplify things, a meeting with someone she said I'd already approved. "You seemed fine with it last week," she said lightly. Last week, I replayed every conversation from the past month in my mind, searching for the moment I might have nodded without realizing what I was giving away. But the memory wasn't there. That's when I understood the danger. When someone questions your memory often enough, you begin to doubt it yourself. And once that doubt takes root, it can be used for anything. So I began writing things down. Not dramatically, not like evidence in a crime, just small notes on a legal pad by the phone. Times, dates, exact words, what I had actually agreed to and what I had not. Within days, something unsettling emerged. The same conversations resurfaced, slightly altered, decisions reintroduced as old discussions. My own words, softened, reshaped, presented that to me as consent. I wasn't forgetful. I was being rewritten. One evening, while flipping through my notes, a strange calm settled over me. Fear had burned itself out, replaced by clarity. If my memory was being questioned, then facts would have to speak for me. And facts, unlike people, don't change their stories. That was the moment I stopped wondering if something was wrong and started asking myself a far more troubling question. Who stood to gain from me forgetting? Once I started paying attention, the changes became impossible to ignore. They weren't loud or sudden. They slipped in quietly, dressed in convenience. My bank statements began arriving later than usual. When I asked about it, I was told they'd streamlined things and switched me to paperless. I didn't remember agreeing to that, but apparently I had. Then there were the little decisions I no longer seemed to be making. The car keys removed to a different drawer. My calendar had new entries in handwriting that wasn't mine. A repairman showed up one afternoon to fix the bathroom rails, something I hadn't requested and didn't feel I needed. I almost said something, almost asked who had arranged it, but the explanation had already been offered, neatly and confidently, before I could open my mouth. "Oh, it's just to make things easier," my daughter said, smiling in that careful way people do when they're doing enough to alarm you. Easier for home. I began to notice how often the word safety was used. Safety to justify changes. Safety to explain why doors needed extra locks, why my evening walks were discouraged, why my checkbook had quietly gone missing. Each change by itself seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. Control doesn't arrive with an announcement. It comes wrapped in kindness, delivered in pieces small enough that you're expected to be grateful. That night, I lay awake replaying the day, realizing something that unsettled me more than any single change. Nothing had been taken from me outright. I had been guided, nudged, redirected, always with a gentle hand and a reasonable explanation. And the longer it went on, the harder it would be to point to exactly the moment it crossed the line. That was the real risk, not losing my independence all at once, but losing it so quietly that one day I wouldn't even know how to ask it back. The first real shock came on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home from the grocer's, arms aching slightly, mind clear, feeling oddly proud of myself for managing it all by myself. The house was quiet in that familiar, comforting way. Then I noticed the silence was wrong. My answering machine light was blinking, full. Not one or two messages, full. I pressed play. Voices I recognized filled the room. My daughter, my son-in-law, some woman from somewhere official. They were polite, efficient, and they were talking about me. She won't need to be involved in this part. Best if we move forward while she's resting. We'll adjust the paperwork and explain it once it's settled. Once it's settled. I stood there with the grocery bag still on the counter, milk slowly warming, bread untouched, listening as plans unfolded without my consent.
my role reduced to a future explanation. I checked my phone. Missed calls, conversations that happened during the 1 hour I was out, during the only part of the day I wasn't reachable. They hadn't missed me by accident. This had been timed. For the first time, I felt something sharper than fear. I felt replaced. Not removed completely, that would raise questions. Instead, I was being edited out quietly, carefully, present enough to comply, absent enough not to interfere. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I've raised children, balanced checkbooks, signed my name with confidence, and tried to steady my breathing. This wasn't about forgetfulness. It was about exclusion.
And the most dangerous part was this. Everyone involved believed they were being reasonable. That's when I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Honesty wouldn't protect me anymore. I would need something stronger than trust. I would need proof before the next decision was made without me. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I asked for help without explaining why. Not from family, not from anyone who already had opinions about what I could or couldn't handle. I made an appointment across town with a man whose name I barely remembered, but whose reputation I trusted. He had handled paperwork years ago, after my husband passed. Back then, he spoke slowly, listened carefully, and never assumed. When I sat across from him now, I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I simply described changes. Small ones. Reasonable ones. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and said something that surprised me. This happens more often than people think. He explained it gently, how concern can slide into control, how good intentions don't cancel out consequences, how independence can be lost quietly, long before anyone realizes it's gone. Then he asked a single question. Do you want things to stay this way? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought of the blinking answering machine, the missing checkbook, the decisions already made in my name, and how upset someone might be if they knew I was sitting here. No, I said finally. He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer all along. What we discussed next wasn't dramatic. No confrontations, no ultimatums. Just a safeguard, something quiet, proper, legal, a way to make sure no one could speak for me, sign for me, or decide for me unless I truly needed it. When I left his office, the air felt different, lighter. Nothing had changed on the surface, but beneath it, something important had shifted. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't waiting to see what would be decided about me. I had decided something for myself. I didn't tell anyone what I had done. I wanted to see what would happen. Over the next few days, I became careful in a new way. I chose my words slowly. I asked simple questions. I paused before agreeing to anything. And more than anything, I watched reactions instead of listening to explanations. That's when the tone shifted. Suggestions grew firmer. Smiles stayed a moment too long. Beneath the kindness, I sensed urgency, like people trying to finish something before a door quietly closed. One afternoon, my daughter mentioned a meeting I was expected to attend. "It's just a formality," she said. "You won't really have to do anything." A formality. I asked who else would be there. She hesitated. Not long, just long enough. That pause told me more than her answer ever could. I declined, calmly, politely, without offering an explanation. The reaction didn't come right away. It arrived later, in pieces. A phone call, concerned voices, questions carefully wrapped as worry, gentle reminders of how much easier things could be if I insisted on handling everything myself. That was the test, and I passed it.
Because the moment I asserted myself, without anger, without confusion, the urgency sharpened, the pressure increased, and in that response, their assumptions reveal themselves. They hadn't been helping me manage, they had been managing around me. That evening, I sat alone and reviewed the documents from my appointment, running my fingers over the neat signatures and dates. I felt something steady settling my chest. Whatever came next, I was no longer guessing. I was prepared, and they didn't know it yet. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began with confusion, a bank clerk who suddenly asked to speak directly to me, a request for my signature that couldn't be handled over the phone, a polite refusal when someone tried to make changes on my behalf. Small obstacles, quiet ones, but they disrupted everything. I heard it in my daughter's voice when she called that evening. The certainty was gone, replaced with something tighter. "They said they needed you," she told me. "Did you change something?" I let a moment pass before answering. "No," I said, and it was the truth. I hadn't changed anything. I had clarified it. Over the next few days, explanations became tangled. Appointments had to be rescheduled. Plans were suddenly on hold. People who once spoke with confidence now checked themselves mid-sentence. The story they'd been telling, that I was forgetful, overwhelmed, in need of guidance, no longer fit the facts. And when a story stops working, panic follows. One afternoon, I was asked to come by and talk things through. The invitation was friendly, but the timing felt urgent. I agreed, not because I felt cornered, but because I was ready. As I got dressed that day, I called my reflection in the mirror. For weeks, I'd been seeing myself the way others seemed to see me, fragile, uncertain. Now, I saw something else, someone who'd been underestimated. And as I walked out the door, I knew that whatever waited on the other side of that conversation, the balance had already shifted. We sat at the same table where so many decisions had once been made for me. Coffee was poured, smiles were offered. Everything felt arranged in advance. They began carefully, asking how I'd been feeling, reminding me how difficult the past year had been, speaking in that gentle tone meant to sound supportive while guiding the outcome. Then came the turn. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly," my daughter said. "There were a few things we couldn't move forward on." I nodded. I waited. "That's why we thought it might be best if you—" I placed a folder on the table, not abruptly, not to make a point, just enough to stop the sentence where it was. Inside were documents, neatly organized, properly signed. The room went still. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain myself. I simply said what needed to be said. I am capable of making my own decisions, and I've taken steps to ensure that remains true. They looked at each other, confusion giving way to caution. Questions followed, measured ones. "When did you do this? Who helped you? Why weren't we told?" I answered calmly, briefly, because the details no longer mattered. What mattered was this: the assumption that I wouldn't notice, wouldn't act, wouldn't protect myself was wrong. The tone shifted. The concern in their voices thinned, replaced with something else, something tighter. This was no longer about my well-being. It was about authority they no longer held. And as I watched that realization settle over them, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, relief. Because for the first time in months, the truth was sitting openly on the table, and it was finally speaking for me. Silence has a sound when it lasts long enough. I heard it in the way cups were set down too carefully, in the way no one reached for the papers as if touching them might make everything worse. And then the explanations began. "We were only trying to help. You know how complicated these things can be. We thought this would take the pressure off you." Each sentence was delivered gently, and each one missed the point entirely. Because once control is named, it can't be hidden again. I listened without interrupting. I noticed how often I disappeared from their language. Decisions became necessary. Actions were framed as unavoidable. Responsibility hovered in the room without ever landing on anyone. Then my daughter said something she hadn't planned to say. "We just didn't think you'd notice." The words stayed where they fell. She looked surprised, almost frightened by her own honesty. I didn't react right away. I didn't need to. I did notice, and I noticed how often I wasn't asked. That's when the moment everything shifted, not into anger, not into confusion, into truth. Because there are things that can be explained away, and then there are things that once spoken out loud can't be gathered back up. No amount of concern can soften them. No good intention can undo them. They simply sit there, clear, undeniable, revealing what had been true all along.
They waited for anger, for tears, for forgiveness, perhaps. I offered none of it. Instead, I did something that surprised us all. I ended the conversation. Not abruptly, not coldly, just firmly. "I don't want to argue," I said, "and I don't want to punish anyone, but I do need things to be clear going forward." Clear was not a word they expected. I explained my boundaries the way I now approached everything, slowly, precisely, without apology. What decisions were mine alone, what help I would ask for if I needed it, what would no longer happen without my consent. There were nods, promises, careful reassurances. I accepted them, but I didn't hold on to them, because trust, once shaken, isn't restored by words. It's rebuilt by patterns, over time. When they left, the house felt unusually quiet. Not empty, peaceful. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the afternoon soften into evening. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. I hadn't cut anyone off. I hadn't burned bridges. I had simply reclaimed my place on them. And sometimes that's the strongest choice of all. Life didn't return to how it was before. It became something better. Not louder, not easier, just more honest. Conversations slowed. Questions were asked instead of assumed. Plans were brought to me before they were made, not after. Some days were still awkward. Some silences lasted longer than I wished. But beneath it all was something new and unmistakable. I was present, not as a formality, not as a responsibility, as myself. I noticed the difference in small ways. I chose when to leave the house. I signed what needed signing. I asked for help without feeling managed by it. Independence, I realized, isn't about doing everything alone. It's about being trusted with your own life. One afternoon, as I sorted papers at the same kitchen table where all this had begun, I paused. The table hadn't changed, but I had. And in that quiet moment, I understood something clearly. This was never a story about conflict. It was a story about recognition. And once you are truly seen, you don't disappear again. There is a moment in life when you realize strength doesn't look the way you were taught it would. It isn't loud, it doesn't argue, and it doesn't ask for permission. For me, it arrived quietly, one ordinary morning when I signed my own name on a decision that belonged to me alone and felt no need to explain it to anyone. Nothing dramatic followed, no raised voices, no final speeches, just a subtle shift. Phone calls came to me instead of around me. Questions were asked instead of assumed, and for the first time in a long while, my presence was not a courtesy, it was a given. I didn't win anything, but I did reclaim something: my place, my judgment, my right to be involved in my own life. That's when I understood this.
Independence isn't something you lose all at once, and it isn't something you take back with force. It's protected by attention, by noticing when silence replaces consent, by acting before kindness turns into control. So if you ever feel yourself being gently pushed aside by concern, by helpfulness, by people who believe they know better, pause, pay attention, because the most powerful words you may ever say won't be spoken in anger. They'll be spoken calmly. I've got this. And when you say them and mean them, the world adjusts. Quietly. Just like it did for me.